14.6 million working-age people in the UK are on track to undersave for retirement. That is 4 in 10 adults, according to the government's own analysis of future pension incomes. And without a plan for drawing down your pension when the time comes, you could lose tens of thousands of pounds in unnecessary tax, or run out of money before you reach your late 70s. That is the retirement shift almost nobody prepared you for. Your parents' generation had defined benefit pensions. Their employer promised a fixed income for life, managed the investments, and carried all the risk. That system has been almost entirely dismantled in the private sector. What replaced it is a defined contribution pot. You accumulate the savings, and then you are responsible for turning them into a reliable income for the next 20 or 30 years. Nobody built a default plan for the drawing down part. There is no auto-enrollment for decumulation, no default strategy that switches on when you stop working. The assumption broadly was that retirees would figure it out. Most do not, because nobody told them how. Most people, when they think about retirement risk, picture a market crash wiping out their savings. That is a real concern. But it is not the primary risk. The primary risk is the order in which you withdraw your money, and that decision has to be made before any crash arrives. Get it wrong, and a perfectly ordinary market downturn can cut 6 or 7 years off the life of your pension pot. What strikes me is how rarely this is explained before people retire. I have watched people approach this moment with a solid pension pot and no clear idea how to draw it down safely. The system was built to get you to save. It was not built to help you spend. There is a plan you can build yourself, though. It starts with one number you can work out today, and I am going to walk you through every step of it. Let me run through the numbers first, because this is where most explanations fall short. Imagine you have a £100,000 defined contribution pot. You are drawing £500 a month from it. With modest annual growth of 3%, that pot lasts approximately 22 years. That sounds manageable. But here is the variable that almost nobody accounts for before they retire. In year 1 of your retirement, the market falls by 20%. Your pot drops to £80,000. You carry on withdrawing that same £500 a month because your bills do not stop. Your investments are now recovering from a smaller base while you are simultaneously drawing them down. Run the same growth rate forward, and that pot runs dry in roughly 16 years. 6 fewer years of income from the same withdrawal rate. The only thing that changed was when the downturn happened. That is sequence of returns risk. It is not about how much your investments grow across your lifetime. It is about when the bad years arrive relative to when you start withdrawing. And it is the single biggest structural risk in a defined contribution retirement, one that most people have never heard of before they face it. Here is why it matters so much right now. When your parents retired with a defined benefit pension, their employer absorbed this risk entirely. The income arrived whether markets were up or down. With a defined contribution pot, that risk has shifted to you. You carry it, and the system made that switch without giving you a framework to deal with it. This is not your fault. The retirement income system was designed for a world in which employers managed the sequence risk. That world is largely gone. The replacement system arrived. The guidance did not. The Institute for Fiscal Studies, in a 2025 report on managing defined contribution wealth, concluded that individuals should be steered towards annuitizing at least some of their pension later in retirement, specifically to protect against longevity and sequence risk. That is the kind of structural protection the system should have built into the default path. It has not done so. If you are approaching retirement and want a clear, practical approach to protecting your income against exactly this kind of risk, subscribe now. I am putting together a complete decumulation framework here, the kind the pension industry should have built for you, one step at a time. The mechanics of the trap are now clear. But the bigger challenge is not understanding the risk. It is having a practical plan for managing it. So let us build that plan now. The framework has 3 parts: a floor, a buffer, and a clear withdrawal order. 3 components that replace guesswork with a system you can actually manage. Start with the floor. This is your guaranteed income, the amount that arrives every month regardless of what markets are doing. Write down your projected state pension amount. If you have any defined benefit pension from a previous employer, add that in too. If you plan to keep working part-time, include that income as well. The floor does not need to cover everything. It just needs to cover your non-negotiable outgoings. Next, work out your essential spending. Food, housing costs, utilities, transport, and any fixed bills you cannot realistically cut. Subtract the floor from that figure. The gap that remains is what your defined contribution pot must cover each year. Now build the buffer. Take that annual gap and multiply it by 2. That is your cash buffer target. If your floor provides £6,000 of an £18,000 essential spending requirement, your annual gap is £12,000. 2 years of that is £24,000. That amount goes into a dedicated easy access cash account before you start touching your invested pot. That cash is not idle money sitting around doing nothing. It is insurance. When markets fall, you draw from the cash buffer instead of selling investments at a depressed price. Your pot stays intact through the downturn. Then, once conditions improve, you replenish the buffer from your tax-free pension cash or from your ISA, where withdrawals attract no income tax. Let me show you what this looks like in practice. Take someone we will call Sarah. She is 62. She has a defined benefit pension paying £6,000 a year, a defined contribution pot of £200,000, and essential spending of £18,000 a year. Her floor covers £6,000, so she needs £12,000 a year from her pot. Her 2-year cash buffer target is £24,000, which she sets aside as part of the 25% tax-free lump sum she is entitled to take when she moves into drawdown. In year 1, the market falls by 20%. Without the buffer, Sarah has to sell £12,000 worth of her investments at the bottom, permanently reducing the capital that will compound over the next 20 years. With the buffer, she does not touch her investments at all for 2 full years. She draws from the cash account, allows the market to recover, and then replenishes the buffer from ISA withdrawals, which are completely free of income tax. The difference in pot longevity from that one decision alone is estimated at 5 to 7 years. The withdrawal order matters as much as the buffer itself. Draw from cash first, then from the ISA, which is tax-free. Only draw from the taxable pension pot when those sources are genuinely exhausted. Followed consistently across a long retirement, this sequence can save a substantial amount in income tax. I used to think the smartest approach was to keep everything invested and withdraw a fixed percentage each year, the way most financial textbooks recommend. Then I looked at what happened to someone who retired at the very start of 2000 and followed that rule. By 2003, their pot was down around 40%, and it never fully recovered in real terms. I changed my thinking entirely after that. The framework is not complicated, but there is one piece that almost everyone misses when they first try to set it up, and that single gap could cost you £30,000 in income tax over the life of your retirement. We will come to that in a moment. The 2008 financial crisis is the clearest real-world illustration of what sequence risk actually does to a pension pot. Consider someone who retired in late 2008 at age 65 with a defined contribution pot entirely invested in equities. No cash buffer. Their state pension covered part of their living costs, but they were still drawing 4% a year from the pot to cover the rest. Within 6 months, that pot had fallen by around 30%. They carried on drawing because they had to pay their bills. By the time markets recovered in 2009 and 2010, they had already sold a substantial portion of their investments at the lowest point those investments reached. The sustainable withdrawal rate from that depleted pot was permanently lower, not because of anything they did wrong, but simply because of when they chose to retire. This is why early downturns are so much more destructive in retirement than at any other stage of life. When you are 40 and your pension falls by 30%, you can wait. You keep contributing, you buy more units at a lower price, and the eventual recovery works in your favor. When you are 65 and drawing down, that same 30% fall means you are selling units at their lowest price. You participate far less in the recovery because you have already reduced the capital base. The longevity picture makes this even more pressing. According to the Office for National Statistics, life expectancy at age 65 in the UK is now 19 years for men and 21 years for women. 1 in 4 people who reach 65 today will live to 90 or beyond. That means retirement can comfortably last 30 years, which is twice the duration most people mentally plan for when they first approach it. The old defined benefit system was built precisely for this reality. It paid income for as long as you lived, however long that turned out to be. The longevity risk sat with the pension scheme, not with you. With a defined contribution pot, that risk now sits entirely with you. If you live to 90, your pot needs to sustain an income to 90. There is no guaranteed payment at the end of the line. A 2-year cash buffer does not solve longevity risk in isolation. What it does is buy you time when markets are volatile and your options are limited, and over a retirement that could last 30 years, that time is worth a great deal. Living longer is only good news if your income lasts long enough for you to enjoy it. And that is why a realistic stress test matters more than most people realize. Let us run a stress test that combines 2 challenges at once, because that is usually how financial shocks arrive in real life. Imagine someone who has just retired at 65 with a defined contribution pot of £180,000 and no cash buffer. Their monthly withdrawal is £1,000 to cover the essential costs their state pension does not reach. In year 2 of their retirement, markets fall by 30%. Their pot drops to around £126,000 while the withdrawals continue. They are selling investments at their lowest price simply to cover the bills, with no alternative available to them. Then, in year 3, their spouse needs residential care. The average annual cost of residential care in the UK is now around £60,000 according to Langbuisson's 2025 figures. Even a partial contribution of £15,000 to £20,000 a year forces additional withdrawals from an already depleted pot. They are locking in losses at the worst possible moment, with no buffer and no flexibility left. Now run the same scenario for someone who built the floor and buffer framework before they retired. Their 2-year cash buffer of around £24,000 to £30,000 covers essential spending throughout the downturn. Their investments stay untouched while the market falls. When care costs arise, they are partly managed through the buffer and partly through a partial annuity purchased at age 70, which added a layer of guaranteed income specifically for this kind of later life need. The invested pot participates fully in the market recovery. The difference in outcomes over a 25-year retirement is not small. It can be the difference between running short of money in your mid-80s and maintaining a comfortable income well into your 90s. The point of running this scenario is not to alarm you. A relatively modest buffer, somewhere in the range of £24,000 to £30,000 for many people, gives you an enormous amount of flexibility when life does not go according to plan. You do not need to predict the market. You just need a plan that does not depend on perfect timing. So how do you actually build that buffer? And where do you keep it? That is where most people make their first, and most costly, mistake. The framework only works if you actually put it in place. So here are the 4 steps to build your own decumulation plan. Step 1 is to calculate your floor. Write down your projected state pension amount. You can check your state pension forecast through your personal tax account on the government website. If you have a defined benefit pension from a previous employer, add that figure. If you plan to keep some part-time work going, include that income too. Add it all up. That total is your floor. It is the income that arrives every month regardless of what markets are doing. Step 2 is to work out your essential spending. Not everything you spend each month, just the amount you genuinely cannot cut. Mortgage or rent costs, food, utilities, transport, fixed insurance, and any regular healthcare costs. Subtract your floor from that figure. The gap is the amount your defined contribution pot needs to provide each year. Multiply it by 2. That is your cash buffer target. Step 3 is to build the buffer. Open a dedicated easy access savings account specifically for this purpose, separate from your current account and separate from any investment account. Look for a provider offering a competitive rate. National Savings and Investments, which is backed by the government, is one option worth including in your search. The key requirement is that this money must be accessible at short notice and must not be invested in anything that can fall in value. The buffer loses its function the moment you try to make it grow aggressively. This is where most people go wrong. They keep the buffer in a standard account paying 0.5% or less, which means inflation is quietly eroding its real value by 3 to 4% a year. On a £24,000 buffer, that is close to £1,000 in lost purchasing power every year. Switching to a properly competitive instant access account is one of the simplest and highest impact changes you can make. Step 4 is to establish the withdrawal order. When you need income beyond your floor, draw from the cash buffer first. When the buffer falls to around 1 year's worth, replenish it from the 25% tax-free pension cash lump sum you are entitled to take, or from your ISA, where withdrawals attract no income tax. Only once those sources are genuinely exhausted should you begin drawing from the main taxable pension pot. Following this sequence consistently across a long retirement can reduce your lifetime income tax bill by a substantial amount. I remember sitting with a client a few years back. We will call her Sarah. She had a pension pot of £200,000 and was genuinely frightened to spend anything from it. She was keeping 80% of her savings in cash, saying it was for safety. But that cash was sitting in an account paying around 0.5%, and with inflation running at the level it was, she was losing approximately £8,000 in real purchasing power every year. We mapped out a proper floor, set up a correctly sized cash buffer in a decent rate account, and invested the rest with a clear withdrawal sequence. A couple of months later, she said she felt in control of her finances for the first time since she had stopped working. The steps are not complicated. What makes them difficult is not the arithmetic. It is the psychology sitting behind the decisions, and that is what we need to look at next. Most people who struggle with decumulation are not struggling because of the numbers. They are struggling because of what the numbers mean to them emotionally. Two patterns come up consistently. The first is a scarcity mindset. This is the tendency to see the pension pot as a finite pile of money that will eventually run out, and to respond by spending as little as possible. People caught in this pattern often live almost entirely on their state pension and leave the defined contribution pot untouched for years, even when drawing from it sensibly would improve their quality of life and reduce their lifetime tax bill at the same time. The second is short-term myopia. The brain is not naturally suited to 30-year planning horizons. It focuses on the next few months. So people make decisions based on this year's costs while failing to account for the fact that they may need this income until age 90 or 92. A strategy that feels conservative and careful in year 1 can turn out to be completely inadequate by year 20. If you have ever felt genuinely anxious about spending money from your pension pot, or if you have been tempted to leave it untouched and live on the state pension alone, you are not unusual. That response is completely normal. The brain tends to treat a large pot of savings the way it would treat physical cash in an envelope, something finite and fragile that should not be disturbed. The reframe that tends to help most is this. Instead of seeing your defined contribution pot as a shrinking pile of cash, think of it as a machine that generates a monthly income. The cash buffer is the fuel tank. It keeps the machine running without forcing you to go into the engine during difficult conditions. The invested portion is the engine itself. Your job is not to watch the fuel gauge obsessively. Your job is to calibrate the machine and let it run. I will be honest about this. When I first started managing my own retirement investments, I made exactly that mistake. I kept far more in cash than the strategy required, because it felt safer. My portfolio barely grew for close to 3 years as a result. I had to learn to trust the system rather than react to the feeling. It is entirely normal to feel nervous about drawing down a pension pot. Just do not let that nervousness become the strategy. You now have the framework, the steps, and a realistic picture of the psychology. Let us bring it all together. Let us bring this together. The shift from defined benefit to defined contribution pensions is the defining retirement challenge for anyone approaching 60 or 65 today. It is not primarily a story about market volatility or economic cycles. It is a story about who carries the risk. Over the past 20 years, that risk has been quietly transferred from employers to individuals, without a great deal of support or guidance along the way. The specific trap is this: without a plan for drawing down your defined contribution pot, you are exposed to a sequence of returns risk. An early market downturn can permanently damage the pot you need to last 25 or 30 years. The solution is not complex, a floor that tells you what is guaranteed, a 2-year cash buffer that protects your investments from forced selling at the wrong time, a clear withdrawal order that minimizes the tax you pay across your entire retirement. Those 3 elements together give you a decumulation framework that holds up even when markets do not cooperate. You do not need to be a financial expert to manage this well. You need 3 numbers: your floor, your essential annual spending, your buffer target. Work those out, put the cash account in place, and you have a framework that gives you real control regardless of what the market does. If you have stayed with this video, you are already approaching retirement planning more seriously than most people do. Subscribe to the channel. I am building a full, practical decumulation guide here, one step at a time. The retirement shift has been arriving gradually for 20 years, and it is now fully here. You may not have been warned about it in advance, but from this point forward, you are not unprepared for it. Start with your buffer. Get the withdrawal order right, and you will have a plan that works on your terms. See you next time.